Please welcome our panelists, Minister of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development of the Kingdom of Morocco, Her Excellency Leila Benali, Chief Technology Officer of Gas Power, Europe, Middle East and Africa, part of GE Vernova, Otmane Benamar, Chief Executive Officer of All On, Caroline Eboumbou, Managing Director and Lead Portfolio Manager of Impact Investments and Allianz Global Investors, Martin Ewald, and our moderator, reporter at Bloomberg News, Antony Sguazzin.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're here to discuss clean energy. We'll take a seat. Really just looking at Africa and looking at the resources we have. We have some of the world's best solar resources, a lot of wind resources. Yet last year we saw investment in the sector slump to a 10-year low. Sorry, not last year, in 2021. So we're going to look at why that's the case, what strategies we can employ to reverse that, the role of fossil fuels, why it's so hard to attract investment in fossil fuel projects going forward, and then just looking at the future as well, green hydrogen and what other options we may have. We'd like some audience participation, so if you'd like to ask questions, please do use the QR code, and I'll be able to see your questions right here, and we'll hopefully have some audience interaction. Anyway, to get things started, we're going to start with the Minister, and I'd like you just to speak about the renewable energy sector, what the challenges are in getting investment, and what Africa needs to do, Morocco as well as the whole continent.
Thanks, Antony. I think it's a great question because, as you heard in the earlier panels and the earlier discussions, Africa might have the best potential in terms of renewable wind, solar storage. I know that there are some battery players in the room, but at the same time, it's really challenging to attract those investments because there is a need to get a pipeline of bankable projects that will be doable. And the other issue that I think is being faced now is really the grid. Now we are in that situation where, after years of underinvestment in the grids worldwide, but of course in Africa, Africa took a toll in those decrease in investment. So if I take the example of Morocco, we've been quite far in our electrification program. We have more than 99.8% of our population that is electrified. However, we are now facing that issue of the last mile and the quality of service that you provide first to the last 10%. And of course, those 0.2% that are left are the most frustrated, the poorest, and they want to have access to this sort of energy. So the traditional model of building large plants, renewables or others, and linking them to a grid that has suffered from years of underinvestment just doesn't work. And we have that conviction now in Morocco that we need to build in agile business models to enable the investors that are, of course, very happy to come invest in Morocco, to have that pipeline of projects with different sizes, with, of course, the guarantee, of course, to be able to either inject into the grid or to create an ecosystem of mini-grids in those decentralized areas. So this is in a nutshell how we are tackling the electrification challenge that Morocco and other countries in Africa are facing.
Great. Martin, perhaps I can ask you, you work in the finance industry. What needs to be done and what are the solutions to getting enough finance onto the continent to make the energy transition happen?
I think it starts with the acknowledgement, to create an environment for institutional investors, and therefore also it's great to hear the Minister explaining how that is done. And then the next steps will be how can we really physically mobilize institutional capital? And this is what we try to do by bringing that in from Europe, and we need to acknowledge that especially renewable energy investments, long-term investments require long-term cash yields, a given level of return. That is something we try to bridge by building blended finance solutions. So we sit in an asset management company, Allianz Global Investors, and we build funds which enable us to provide equity for such projects on the ground. So we are financing local teams on the ground, really capable of building the required infrastructure. And the way we do that is we de-risk on fund level using public money in Germany, for example. So the German government, for example, gives us a first loss provision, which allows us to de-risk the portfolio we're investing into, and that in turn enables us to use institutional capital like life insurance money from Europe, as in this case Germany, to flow into Africa, and the long run to catalyze change, because we don't believe it's good enough to just pick a single asset. We need to build an ecosystem, and that then should really create further growth.
Right. And Otmane, is there a role for fossil fuels like gas? I mean, there's a lot of talk about it being a transition fuel, but there are a lot of opponents of fossil fuel in any form. What role does the fuel play?
The gas is really important to support the energy transition because all the renewables simply need stable power generation to deal with the intermittency. Additionally, when you look at a continent like Africa, some countries have natural resources that supports hydropower or wind or solar, but others have also fossil fuels. That's what will help them really start their energy transition, because with the sale of the gas and the exploration of the gas, they can start their energy transition. So definitely we need to make sure that we have power that gets to the consumer, to the industrial, when there is no sun, when there is no wind. And this is not on, we've seen challenges even in advanced countries where they had to go for fossil fuels even between season and season. I look at the numbers for 5 major important countries in Europe. In the year of 2021, there was a reduction into wind production of 7%. And luckily, they had assets to support that. So it's not only from a day to day, which you can solve with batteries. So there is also seasonal aspect. And there is also with the climate change, unfortunately, we've seen also droughts in Europe, for example, that affected substantially the production of hydro. And we need to make sure, as we're doing this transition in Africa, we learn from those lessons and we build a resilient grid. And we also need, in a lot of countries, to provide the affordable power. And in a lot of cases, that affordable power is natural gas.
Right. And Caroline, perhaps I can come to you. We've spoken a lot about renewable energy. We normally talk about utility scale plants that are connected to the grid. With your background, you've looked at a lot of projects where people aren't connected to the grid. What are the options and how do we finance those?
Indeed. Grid connection is still a challenge in many of our countries with regards to how far transmission lines have been extended. So what do we do in the meantime? Because it's clear, the data is there and shows that when it comes to electricity access, 80% of the people in rural areas are best served through off-grid and DREs, decentralized renewable energy solutions. So it's key when we look at reaching our goals when it comes to universal energy access to ensure that we have a multi-pronged approach and not only look at developing the grids and strengthening the utilities, which is very important, but it has to be done in parallel of the efforts in the decentralized renewable solutions off-grid. What are we talking about? Mini-grids, solar home systems, name it. There are many alternatives that are already providing energy access to population who would not have access to electricity without those solutions. So the solutions are out there, but what's still missing? If we want to get to scale in the mini-grid sector, off-grid sector in general, one imperative is to look at the cost. Cost is still an obstacle. Cost of capital for providers of mini-grids and other DRAs in the sector is still a deterrent. Especially, again, we talk about Africa, accessing debt is done at very high, the double-digit numbers for the providers in this sector, and it's just not sustainable. Not only cost of capital, but also what type of capital. Because we do have some initiatives where you have some debt available, but now equity is also lacking. So we do have to have providers who are in the sector providing equity. One last thing I would say on the very topic is the fact that as much as ultimately we want off-grid sector that will be free of subsidies. For now, it is still a reality that because it's a nascent sector, the off-grid sector needs a subsidy. And there are some good mechanisms out there. There are some facilities that do result-based financing and others, and we need to consider how these are still strengthened so that over time, yes, we will phase out subsidy, but we will support this nascent sector with this much-needed capital for now.
Martin, just on that point, these mini-grid projects, these off-grid projects, is that something that you see the private sector being interested in? Or do you think all the money is really flowing to the bigger projects?
Interest, totally interest, yes, I think that's for sure. But on the other hand, like you also have to take into account the realities of an institutional investor, and that's like also the fiduciary duty one has. And then depending on where the money comes from, it's very hard to invest because like you have it's very hard to run a physical due diligence. So people like me who have to take a decision, you need like a certain size to really be able to properly evaluate. I think that's one of the points. On the other hand, it is something where we really see decentralized energy production will be important for future reference. And maybe just like really to pick up on the type of capital, equity is really exactly there needed because you can't properly bank on that. So you really need to finance it with equity, and that needs to grow. And this catalytic role, I think, if I were to have one wish to the political agenda, is like to differentiate a bit more in what kind of capital should be mobilized. Should not be about like the trillions, whatever. It should be equity, catalytic, and then the political agenda should, especially in Europe, also should differentiate a bit what is flowing when. And this is one of the examples where we can really see how important equity will be in the equation.
Okay, and just turning back to the grid. Where I'm based in South Africa, the biggest impediment is the grid. It's not strong enough, and therefore you cannot add renewable energy in the places where it's most easily produced. The arid areas of the country, but obviously economically not as active as other areas. Is it a big impediment, Minister, across Africa? And here in Morocco and elsewhere, is it a big impediment to the strength of the grid?
It is more than an impediment. It's really a requirement to invest in it. I mean, last week I announced in Parliament that we need to invest roughly between $1 and $2.5 billion per year. And a large chunk of that is going into reinforcing the grid to enable the penetration of renewables down the road. My issue with that is, it's not the amount that is an issue. And if you allow me for a second, I'll put my hat of President of United Nations Assembly for the Environment that Morocco has the privilege of chairing until next year. The issue today is not to have the numbers to add up. It's really that flow of investment that has to go, especially when it comes to the grid, with no interruption every year. It requires a lot of trust, of course, on both sides. But in the case of Africa, in most African countries, there is no time to wait, because you have 600 million people who don't have access to any modern form of energy, let alone electricity. And these are countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to environmental issues and pollution, which are tackling their day-to-day sources of income in large informal sectors. So I think trying to get the numbers to add up, I'm sorry to say, it's going to be a bit a waste of time. Sure. We all know where the money will have to flow. We are making sure, at least in Morocco, that the regulatory framework is there, that the fiscal terms are there, and that the ability of our partners, equity and debt, are enabled to get access to those risk-adjusted returns, because I think that's the key word. If we understand every word of those three terms, risk-adjusted returns, in reinforcing the grid and making sure that you are thinking more creatively about the business model of producing, transporting, and consuming electricity, I think we would be able to win this energy transition. But as I said, we're not in 1810 when we had the first oil development. We're not in 1946 after the Second World War. We're not in 1979. We are in 2023. And we have 600 million people in Africa who are craving access to modern forms of energy. Plus, we also have in Morocco a large industrial tissue that is also craving competitive, low costs and low carbon energy. So I think today, with the challenges that we are facing, we really have to come up with that stream of investments in those bankable projects, including reinforcements of the grid today. So in that $1 to $2 billion of investments, I think we have at least half a billion dollars that goes into reinforcing the grid. And you are all welcome to help us win this challenge, because in addition to reinforcing the grid to give access to our social and economic tissue, to give them access to low-cost, low-carbon energy, we are also wanted to reinforce our interconnection and access to the international markets. And that convergence of energy and carbon markets between Africa, Europe, and I know that we have some of our players in the financial markets, is quite key as well in winning this transition.
Sure. Okay, we've got a few questions from the audience, so perhaps I could just start with you, Caroline. One of the questions from the audience is, if clean energy is still not inclusive in being available and affordable to everyone to solve the energy challenges, what should Africa do to make energy more accessible?
So what should Africa do? Well, let me take some very specific example when it comes to, because indeed it is a big continent. I'll refer to Nigeria very, very specifically. When it comes to ensuring that clean energy, affordable clean energy, has been made a priority. Nigeria has put together an energy transition office, which has been quite relentless with regards to ensuring that all of the different stakeholders are mobilized and are acting in unison to really find solutions to Nigeria's long-term goal when it comes to universal energy access. Earlier on, one of the panelists mentioned one of the panelists was referring to extending the example escapes me. But when it comes to Nigeria, as I was saying, we've put together a private sector working group where you have all of the different provider of capitals working with the government, working with the civil society, and really looking at what exactly is going to take to bring the cost down. I mentioned earlier subsidy, but not only. We mentioned the fact that there are different sources of capital. We have different service provider of capital. And while some do require some very elevated returns, some do not. So we have to look at what it will take by different class of assets, what are the different providers of capital available, and make this, and then make that gap, make that bridge between the different providers. And there are already, for instance, initiatives whereby we're working with guarantee providers who can provide a guarantee and then therefore bring the cost of capital down, working with equity provider, debt provider, all that to say that the numbers are high, the amount is tremendous. That being said, because there are different profiles available, we can get to that risk-adjusted return that was mentioned by the minister, and therefore eventually bring the cost down of renewable energy.
Great. Martin, I see you wanted to say something a minute ago, so I'm going to ask you the next question, and perhaps you can tack that on as well.
Sure.
We're just being asked here, what do we need to activate public-private participation projects?
Exactly, that question really helps me to also pick up on this risk-adjusted return. Because one of the points really, as you say, it needs to be risk-adjusted return. And we want to mobilize more renewable energy, so therefore the price should be high in order to generate high returns for institutional investors. At the same time, we want it to be low, otherwise it can't be catalytic. And so therefore, the price of energy will be set. And as you say, we need to bring the costs down. And so for us, the only way on how we can provide then this public and private to work together is just limit the risks, because electricity prices must be set at a certain point. And this is what we try to do with blended finance, not only on the capital stack, but also in the cooperation. So we run our Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, for example, together with the European Investment Bank, on the transactional level to form such partnerships. And I think the future I see in partnerships, also public and private, is not just de-risking, like forming a capital stack, but really cooperating. So the grid operators need to understand what the operators of the assets need, what the investors need, and I think this dialogue is quite important, which is why I'm so glad that we're also allowed to be speaking here, because this is the starting point on how you can have that dialogue, and I think then something fruitful can evolve.
Great. Just switching tack a little bit. Otmane, you work with gas. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, green hydrogen. Mm-hmm. This part of the world is considered to be a place where it could well be developed quite extensively. Mm-hmm. Is it a threat to gas? Do you see companies like your own transitioning to the use of hydrogen?
I don't consider it as a threat. I think for us, I see it as a chance, right? Because you mentioned gas as a transition. Nobody wants to invest in something that, like in 10 years down the road, will be stranded because the policy is more stringent and you cannot use natural gas, or the funding are not available to support it. So hydrogen is the chance to make sure that this dependable capacity and the flexible capacity is still there. So the technology is already today available to burn gas and to produce in gas turbines and combined cycles. And in combination with other technologies as well, we have the carbon capture. But I would like to step back a little, because everybody's thinking, how can we get to zero? But the question is, like what Madame la Ministre said, is about the investment. We need it now. We need also solution now, because that credit of carbon, CO2, we cannot tap into it until we get the ultimate solution that will nail the CO2 down to zero, right? So we need to take care about the assets that are there. There are billions of assets that can be upgraded to get more power, to get more efficient power without adding fuel. So these upgrades are available, can be done within a short time. And there is also a lot of assets that are in what we call, even in Morocco, what we call simple cycle, which is barely 30% efficiency. We can put them in a combined cycle and improve the efficiency all the way to around 50%. So it will get you 50% more power without adding fuel, and drop the carbon intensity by 30%. So, and a lot of assets like that are existing in this continent. So that's something we can do in medium term. And we also can displace some of the inefficient assets, like you mentioned Nigeria. 13 gigawatts of Nigeria is made by household or small-scale power diesel engine. It's not safe. It's very expensive. So developing high efficient, today the efficiency of combined cycle is around 60%, more than 60%, 64%. So developing those kind of assets will help improving the reliability, and it will help addressing as well the cost of the electricity. And as I said in my introduction, those assets can, when the hydrogen becomes affordable, that's the question. Is it affordable to be used for power generation or not? Not only is it available, but it's also, can we make it affordable? When it will be available, of course, we are happy to switch to hydrogen and have net zero emissions on those power plants.
Okay. Minister, perhaps I can ask you, does Morocco have a vision for hydrogen? Where do you see that fuel playing a role in your country's future?
I think we have, if you remember, Antony, on November 22nd, we had a meeting with His Majesty the King, and he gave us his instructions to prepare a hydrogen offer. And I think the work is nearly done, and Mr. Prime Minister has announced that we will make the hydrogen offer public before the end of the year. And the whole, I think, understanding and the reason why we are taking our time is because we just see the numbers. And the numbers are, you have probably $390 billion or $400 billion that were announced of capital going into green hydrogen. Less than 8% of that is actually committed. Less than 5%, I think, has reached FID, according to, and I don't want to cite a competing intelligence company. But anyway, I mean, the whole point is our role as a country that went through 15 years of experience in developing renewable projects. A country that sits between Africa, Europe, and the Atlantic basin. So that gives you optionality. And we really want to ensure that in this trajectory towards developing new energies, including hydrogen, green ammonia, batteries and storage, we want to ensure that that risk-adjusted return to our partner, to our partners' investors, is really taken into account. So, in that offer, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse and leave that to when the offer will be announced. I think the whole point there is first trust with our international and national partners in that journey, because that journey will take risks. You know, in all the energy transitions that we've seen since we started using horsepower on real horses, it took at least 50 years for every fuel, be it nuclear, renewables, and so on, to take at least 10% of the global market share on at any specific time. And I think somebody was saying earlier today in the panels, why are we asking green hydrogen to play that role in less than 8 years with a large amount of subsidies from specific countries? I think we are today in a situation where we want to, as Morocco, we want to keep that optionality in our system, make sure that all the infrastructure, and when I talk about infrastructure, I'm not only talking about physical infrastructure, and yesterday we signed an agreement with the IFC to help us in revising and updating our national gas roadmap and preparing the gas infrastructure of Morocco of the future to be hydrogen proof and to enable us in that journey so that at the end of the day we don't end up with stranded assets. Because remember, we want to ensure that in this acceleration, because we are in an acceleration of time compared to the 20th century, where, as I mentioned, for those competing technologies, it took 50 years to gain 10% of the global market share, because of the huge geopolitical and changes and the climate issue that now is becoming very clear and very apparent, especially, I mean, in many countries, not only in Europe and North America, but as I mentioned earlier, in some of the most vulnerable countries, there are some islands that are going to disappear before 2040 or 2050. Sure. And that raises for the international community some very unbearable questions of citizenship, of nationality that was never in the card. So I think that acceleration of time that we are all facing because of those very difficult questions that we are being tasked to answer will provide the framework and the infrastructure to enable the development of a sustainable in time energy transition, including with new technologies like hydrogen.
Great, thank you. Martin, one more question for you. Sorry, but there's a lot of finance questions coming from the audience. So for infrastructure or energy investment, is the project finance approach the core approach to rely on solely, or should we be looking at corporate finance, access to bond markets and securitization? Perhaps you could just speak about that a little bit. And also, if you could just touch on the global interest rate cycle and how that's complicating matters.
Yeah, maybe starting really with the interest rate cycle. I think this is one of the really imminent problems we can see in equity and debt due to the hike in interest rates. Of course, the referential return required to mobilize private capital flowing, for example, into Africa will also be higher. So coming back to how much revenue can you generate out of an asset on the ground. And I think that also limits what you can do with regards to structuring your specific transaction. So far, project finance, of course, is very interesting also for the institutional investors. We do nevertheless acknowledge that some of the refinancing cycles are really hard to meet with renewables, no matter what size you're talking about. So therefore also, I guess it's very imminent that different sources of financing must be required. But at the same time, what you also see is that institutional investors, like for example from Europe, who are regulated under solvency, also need to take that into account. So if you talk about permanent capital vehicles, like how can you then get your capital out? And I think until such examples are also set, so really also the institutional investors get data points on how it worked and how it did work in the past, it's very hard to find like very new, like much more new and innovative ways of financing. So therefore, what we do right now is really making the first step in building standard vehicles with a de-risking element, as in blended finance. And I think then we will need to be getting towards more options to also finance the projects on the ground.
Okay. We've just got a few minutes left. So starting with Caroline, I just wanted to ask you all the same question. We've seen the bulk of renewable energy, and I suspect all energy investment take place in just a few countries. South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, maybe one or two others. What do we need to do to spread this investment across the continent? Because we're all facing the same problem. And as we've mentioned several times, about half of all Africans don't have access to electricity. So what do we need to do?
De-risk, de-risk, de-risk. Ultimately, if you want funds to flow to a country, you have to make sure that investors have some visibility with regards to being able to actually reap off the benefits from these investments. You have to have investors who can believe that if they go and invest in a renewable energy project, they have some certainty with regards to, for instance, the tariffs that they can charge, and the fact that there wouldn't be any, due to an election upcoming, a change of tariff being imposed on them, for instance. So ensuring that there is clear visibility sounds basic, but it's the number one thing for investors to know that they can actually go into a country. And how does that work? Regulatory frameworks. I think the countries that you've mentioned have led quite a very clear example of having very clear regulatory frameworks. What does the permitting require, and all of the different steps. Having it clearly laid out allows investors to enter into a country. After that, once you have a very clear regulatory framework, you also obviously have to look at other elements that come into decision makings for investors doing their due diligence. How are they going to get their returns with regards to offtake? What are the different offtake arrangements that are in place? What's going on with the demand? We know that there's a lot of suppressed demand in Africa. How do we exactly right-size that demand and so on? I think that's another important factor as well.
Great. If I can just give you perhaps 30 seconds each. Perhaps, Otmane, you could speak to the same points, and then I'll come to the Minister.
Yeah, I'm representing the technology supplier, so I'm dealing with a lot of countries who are now required to think about the energy transition, and it will be more an ask. I mean, to the financial institution, because we've seen a lot of them backing off from funding fossil fuels. I think the government, especially in Africa, I've seen that a lot of government announced their NDC, so they set the objectives. We need to make sure that financial institutions make their decision based on those objectives, on the energy transition, not on the single solutions. Like if this gas power plant is required to achieve the transition, so it has to be funded. And I think that's an important point which will help the countries achieving their objectives.
Okay. Minister, perhaps I can give you the final word.
Thank you very much. I am actually really, really happy because I see, and thanks to Bloomberg New Economy for choosing Morocco for this event, because I felt in the discussions that we were having today that we are really at a turning point. And why I'm really happy, because compared to 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, we were all sitting in rooms in our different capacities and listening to people, the financial sector and private sector saying, oh, we need de-risk, de-risk, de-risk. And the government saying, oh, but we need access to low cost and low cost capital. And you had also the international community hesitating whether gas is a transition fuel or a destination fuel. And you had all of that hesitation between the different players that just cannot work in the energy transition pathway for any country, let alone for a country in Africa that is basically betting on its energy transition journey. So I'm really happy to see that I think these 3 communities are now actually talking to each other and realizing that the time is now. And the amount of, even if we are not having the perfect project with the perfect structuring of the financial stream with project bonds or blended finance, I think at the end of the day, we are pushing ahead. I think in Morocco and some of the countries that are represented in this room, everything is being put together so that we have those creative solutions put in place.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for the audience questions.